Hello and welcome to CDW Canada Tech Talks podcast. I'm your host, KJ Burke, Field CTO for Hybrid Infrastructure at CDW Canada. I'm joined by Janik Alford. He is the first Chief AI Officer for FinTrack here in Canada, which is awesome. We'll ask you a little bit about that. And James Scott, Field CTO at Dell Canada. Thanks for joining me. Today we want to talk a little bit about sort of the current state of AI and HPC, some of the challenges that we're going through when it comes to the size and scale of HPC and AI, when we look at environmental challenges and that. I want to talk about some of the use cases and some of the ways that we're seeing HPC and AI used traditionally, and then also as we go in the future. But Janik, if you could tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got in the role, and how did you become our first Chief AI Officer?
So yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. And I've been in and out of the public service for almost 2 decades now. And most recently, I've joined FinTrack back in 2020 at the early days of the pandemic. At the time, I said midway through, but it took longer. And so I joined in 2020, and in 2021, I became the CTO at FinTrack. And really, at the time, I was asked by the CIO and the deputy to consider, how do we look towards the future? How do we transform our major systems? That is a common question in federal organizations. And, like any large organization, we deal with a lot of legacy. We want to optimize. We want to use the best technology possible. And so in that role, I stepped in and started leading some modernization teams and started to really engage with what's the state of the art for intelligent systems and things like that. And as we went down that path, we also started to take a serious look at generative AI as it came into the public consciousness, if you will. And I led some initiatives of looking at, again, how do we modernize our systems, and generative AI kept coming up as a major contender as to being able to tackle some of our critical business challenges. And so most recently, and just a couple of weeks ago, I stepped into the role of Chief AI Officer to help the deputy and help the organization to develop a clear vision on what that looks like for us as an organization, and to lay down a pathway forward. So that's what I'm taking on now. And I'm sure we'll get into it, but one of the key things that I'm looking at is trustworthiness for these new technologies, and how a government organization can enable, optimize, enable, enhance, and transform the way people are working. And for us to do that, we have to understand its outer limits. And we know that generative AI is unlike any other enterprise technology that's come before it. It has a lot of promise, but it also has a lot of shortcomings, and we need to have a clear map of what that looks like, and that's why the role was created. And I agreed to step into that role, and I'm happy to see where that goes. And the last thing I'll say, and again, I'm happy to talk about that, as a large organization, we need a community of practice to bring the best minds to think about this. That is going to be partially within government, but it's also going to be partially with the vendor community to be those thought leaders and to come together. And without that community of practice, we're going to trail behind. We're not going to understand how to utilize it. We really need to now come together and contend with this possibility. I think others have said it more clearly than I will. It's as big as the internet. It's as big as computers, and so we're at this next phase, and we need to tackle it together. And so I'm really looking forward through this podcast and upcoming events as well to engage, to tap into those bright minds and figure this out together.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, especially when you look at boiling up all of those various use cases and sharing that knowledge, because I think we're all on this journey together. And James, I know when you and I talk, a lot of times having a vision and having a person that's responsible for that strategy is ahead of where a lot of the people we deal with. But I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself. So James Scott, you'll really appreciate you jumping on. I think I listened to you speak at BCNet, and we talked about proof of productivity, and then I definitely took that one away. But maybe tell me a little bit about being a field CTO at Dell, and kind of how your role is changing with AI in the mix.
Yeah, happy to. So thank you for having me here. I think for me, I found it really interesting. If I look at what we're doing at Dell Technologies across different areas of IT, whether it's AI or cloud or edge computing, modern data center work, modern workforce. What I found fascinating with AI is its overlap into all of those different areas. I can't walk into a customer conversation at the moment without AI being top of mind, whether or not that was the original purpose of the meeting and the discussion, or whether I was actually being brought in to have a conversation, as I said, on maybe it's on hybrid, private, public, multi-cloud discussions. AI is absolutely influencing that. And to your point, like the idea that AI is the next iteration, the next big thing in technology, it's having a huge impact to just about every customer I get the chance to talk to across the entire country. So yeah, happy to be here. And I think this is a huge topic, and we could definitely dive into a lot of different areas.
And you're right. I think it is impacting where we're going. We had a bit of a joke going into the meetings for the last 6 months to a year, which is how long will it take for AI to come up as a mention, and
Right.
and
It's a good drinking game.
yeah, it can be a dangerous one.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the traditional uses, because we talk a lot about generative AI today, but historically, high performance compute, machine learning, traditional AI has driven value. It's still going to drive value. But when we think about some of those big use cases in the government, like Janek, what are you seeing as sort of the traditional baseline of AI and high performance compute utilized by the government?
Well, I don't think that those capabilities ever made it to mainstream. What I observed in my career, and this is my third federal agency that I've worked at, is machine learning and AI have always had a more niche use case where they were around gaining some degree of insights into the operations of the business, and whether that's looking at statistical alignment between disparate events, or whether it's having pattern recognition, or whether it's coming up with really it's been about driving performance in my last three organizations, and it hasn't made it to the end user. Really, it hasn't made it to the person who sits down on a Monday morning who's a program officer who's looking to, or a policy officer. It's been at the periphery, and I think to some degree to the disadvantage of these organizations to some degree. But there is there's a complexity to it, and there's a discipline around data science and analytics that I think has been outside of the skill set or the comfort level of end users. And I think the difference that we're seeing now with generative AI is it's approaching a means of interaction that the ordinary person can understand and to utilize. And so I think that there's a bit of a tension right now between people who have been very active in AI for decades, and now who I think are feeling a little bit maligned in the conversation to say, we've been telling you about this opportunity since 60 years. Like, we know there's something here, and now everyone's interested in AI now. But it's around making these things make sense to ordinary people. And that's what I think generative AI has done. And, I don't think it takes away from the data scientists or the people doing advanced analytics. I think what it's doing is it's making mainstream what used to be a little bit more niche. And now I think there's a greater appreciation for the work that they do. And certainly I would look to those people as the leaders who are going to get us to the next step, because good generative AI will absolutely rely on the data principles and the data insights that those data analysts have been developing. You're not going to get good AI without good data.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And where we see a lot of initial challenges and roadblocks that show up is really with data governance and
Yes.
data management and
100%.
data curation. So absolutely. So James, maybe you can speak a little bit to maybe some of the projects that we've worked on together. I know there's a number of HPC projects, but As you're working with the current state with the federal government, what are some of the use cases that you're seeing as we see more of a democratization, as we start to interact with and open up AI to maybe stakeholders that haven't had access before?
So I think your point on democratization of AI is an absolutely critical one. And Janet, to your point, I think the reason we're seeing so much interest from everywhere is because it's coming from the end users. If I think about past large technology shifts, whether it was going all back to client server days through to virtualization through to cloud, the impact there was to the business. It's here's how we do more with less, here's how we change the way our business works, but the end user wasn't largely impacted. How they access the software, it didn't really change. The big difference here is, and I think this is where some of the struggle is, the end users are kind of demanding it of the business. They've had a chance to go away and play with a chat GPT or a co-pilot system, and they're like, this would be really useful to me if it could answer questions that were related to my work and my line and what I do on a daily basis. I think one of the biggest challenges I'm seeing is how that actually gets implemented. So that sounds good, but in order to do that, I need to give it access to data. I need to trust the system, and I need to have curated that data into that platform. And I think that's where we're struggling right now, because to your point, we've had teams of data scientists, we have people doing data curation, thinking about moving away from, I had a customer describe their data as data puddles into actual data lakes.
Sure.
But you can't drive a lot of AI systems without that. I think the first thing we're going to see, and I'm already starting to see this, is using AI to do intelligent search of data. So using natural language understanding, natural language processing to actually find the information I already had. So rather than anything else, and I think everyone struggles with this, I have internal systems, and I go to find that PDF or I go to find that document, and I can't find it unless I know the title of it already. Right. I need to know exactly what I'm looking for. I think where generative AI has an immediate ability to help everybody is that semantic understanding. Okay, you asked for this, there's some documents over here that relate to that subject. Is this what you're looking for? And to me, that's where I'm seeing a lot of the immediate take-up of AI today.
Yeah, and so if we look at, we talked a little bit about some of the challenges, and I don't want to spend too much time on the challenges, but talked a little bit about, historically needing a specific skill set.
Yeah.
We talked about needing to have curated data. I think in some senses, it's easier for those traditional use cases because the data was really segregated. Maybe it was weather information, or maybe it was some sort of medical information that was really collated and curated, and maybe it was in closed systems where we didn't have this sort of growth of just general data. So we talked about data classification. A little bit about skill set. Which of those challenges is the easiest for us to solve, and which is probably the hardest for us to solve?
I would say the critical challenge, but the one that's easiest to solve, is getting good at data. And so this is both a enabler and a dependency for getting good quality outputs from AI. So we have, any organization that, medium to large organization has millions to tens of millions to hundreds of millions of data points, data files. Humans are traditionally very bad at thinking about what to do with data. We sort of drag it into a pile and drop it. And then once the pile gets too big, we might split the pile again. And we sort of do this only when it becomes a problem. Mm-hmm. So we deal with data essentially as a problem resolution. Our shared drive gets too big, we need to do a cleanup, we need to go to SharePoint. Our SharePoint's too big, we need to do a migration, we need to go to the next thing. And I don't think that, any successful organization in the future will afford to be as bad with our data management as we have been historically. And we've relied a lot on human brains to sort of become the index, if you will, on how to find this information. So we use tribal knowledge, right? So I know that KJ knows where that file is. I'm just going to go ask him, because you possess a portion of the semantic knowledge of the organization. And when you leave an organization, it's lost and it has to be rediscovered. and there's almost like an organizational amnesia that occurs when you lose corporate knowledge. We talk about, she left the organization and we lost so much corporate knowledge.
Yeah.
So I don't think I think that's really holding organizations back. And so what I think one of the promises of these these really capable large language models will be to be our data stewards that we were never able to really implement. So good data stewardship, you bring the file in, it's going to classify it, and it's going to generate the metadata, and it's going to park it, but it's going to remember where it put it. And to your point, it's going to be able to recall it in a way that exceeds our human capacity to do that. And once you have AI on the front end helping to classify information, because it's very capable of doing that, you also then have AI being able to retrieve information. And that goes into, wrap the point up, that goes into one of the biggest use cases in the federal government that I've witnessed from talking to my peers in various departments, is understanding and applying complex policy. And so it's not just so if you put in things like collective agreements, for example, they change every several years, they have all new clauses, there's new policies coming out through Treasury Board and things like that. These all have to be considered by a human to make those determinations. And when you join a team, you don't know the 1,000 files you need to reference to make a reasonable case decision on something. And so if AI can help you triage and understand what you're looking at and then contextualize it amongst the knowledge, it can help people make much more clear policy decisions and bring cases that could take weeks or months to close in minutes or hours. And that's a huge enabler. So I think the data thing, it's absolutely the bridge we have to cross to get the outcomes that we're looking for.
I'll also add, I think the interesting thing to me, and this is partly where the advancements in AI are going to help all organizations, is just how much easier it is now to get access to some of these AI capabilities. Whereas in the past, I might have needed a team of AI and data scientists and these people that really understood this at a deep level to get any kind of value from the data that I'm storing. It's now much easier to do that. It's now much easier to go online and take a model that's been pre-trained. I don't have to train it. I don't need that level of knowledge, or quite frankly, that access to the compute power to do that training.
Right.
I can take something, I can do some inferencing with that existing model without needing teams and teams of people. So this talent shortage is still real. I still need some people that really understand this AI that can do your type of role, where they can help at an organizational level, make sure that we're implementing it sensibly. But I think fundamentally some of the technical hurdles that existed, I will say even 18 months ago, I don't think some of those hurdles exist today when it's as easy it is to get access to tons of different AI models, whether it's text to speech or speech to text or object detection or semantic understanding. These are all things that in the past would have been very complex to do that are now almost trivial.
Can I riff off that for a second? You said something that might trigger some of the listeners and watchers of this podcast around needing less people. And I find that the more I talk to people about AI, there's a few different camps out there, and they're quite triggered by that idea. And I know you didn't mean it that way. Around, I'll need less people, and that AI is sort of it's like a race to the bottom on overhead optimization. I'm just going to get rid of my workforce. I look at it as that couldn't be farther from the truth at this juncture. Who knows? Maybe some wild new capability comes out in 2 months or 2 years or 20 years from now that invalidates what I'm saying. But we're looking at optimization, but people are being overwhelmed in their current role. Like, look at any of the statistics around how people are struggling with workload. We have major statistics that said 70% of the people are saying they're overwhelmed by their workload. We have growing not inefficiencies, but growing challenges around backlogs and clearing customer service requests or case files and things like that. I think that what I'm looking at is relief for people, and I look at it from a service point. I work for FinTrack. We're trying to stop money laundering and terrorist financing. And if you look at any of the disclosures that go out in the public, we're stopping human trafficking, we're stopping fentanyl, we're stopping weapons, of course, in partnership, obviously, with law enforcement, national security. I don't think anyone wants that to take longer.
Yeah.
Right. No one said, we should have let that human trafficker go for a few more months. No, we want to stop that person as fast as possible. And so That's not a reduction of people. That's I think we have an opportunity to maybe reverse the flow that, of people feeling overwhelmed. Now that's going to come with learning some new skills, but there's not a person replacement play from certainly the way I'm seeing it at this point, and I think it's that's one of people's major anxieties around this.
I'll echo that. I'm not seeing that. I'm not seeing any reduction of people. What I am seeing, to your point, is AI is being used to improve productivity
100%.
and take away those things that people didn't want to do that was part of their job. They wanted they didn't want to spend hours creating a PowerPoint presentation, or they didn't want to spend hours summarizing a set of emails from an organization to disseminate that down to their team. The ability to turn to an AI system and say, could you do this kind of boring part of my role for me? We still need human in the loop. Again, this is a huge topic right now of concerns on trust of the output and hallucinogenic effects and that sort of thing. So we still have to have someone curate that, but it's much easier for me to take the output of an AI system and go, okay, this bit's not quite right, I'm going to edit this, than it was to create that from scratch. So it's absolutely, to your point, it's not about reducing the number of people, it's about making those people more productive and hopefully happier in the role they're doing. So.
I agree.
And to that point, I had a conversation with a healthcare provider, and what they were talking about was, from a framing perspective, it was reducing staff. But then I dug into it. I said, are you really looking at reducing, the number of nurses that you have at the hospital? No, they just need the nurses to be able to service more beds.
Right.
And so you're looking at that productivity in real time, driving efficiencies and allowing people to do more. And one of the things that my colleague Michael Trey says is reduce the toil. Like really take the commoditized effort part of the job and let's make it easier on people so they can focus. A doctor became a doctor to help people, not to do all of the paperwork that comes with the role. One of the other big use cases that I see really resonating with a lot of people is the ability to change sort of the narrative tone. So we talk about being able to translate languages, but also being able to say, look, I'm really good at what I do, but I don't necessarily know how to talk to a chief financial officer.
Sure.
I don't necessarily know how to translate this IT jargon into something that this stakeholder will understand. And so I think that's a big use case as well, where we can not just communicate, but do targeted communication with people and help them understand the data better too. So but I like that we're talking about we need data, we need a way to manage the data, and you're right. I think sometimes AI will be the solution to our AI challenge, which is leveraging the classification capabilities there to drive that forward. So when we look at specifically, actually, I wanted to come back because that was a good tangent, but I want to come back to, James, in your role, a lot of where Dell focuses is scaling and looking at AI at a large scale. So as you are looking at helping organizations really deploy in mass at scale, what are some of the challenges that you run into? What are some of the things that organizations need to take care of to be able to scale? And where do they struggle? Maybe what's easy to solve, what's harder to solve?
So it's been fascinating to me to watch the progression of this over the last 18 months. I think when this first kicked off, what we assumed was everyone just needs more infrastructure. So we're just going to throw some GPUs at the problem. We're going to increase the number of CPUs that we've got. We're going to maybe build a data lake and problem solved. What we've learned very quickly is that is not what solves the problem. We've been wrapping these up into what we call these AI factories, and that's not just a marketing term. What that means is we need to look at a specific set of inputs. We need to look at a specific set of applications and services, and we need to drive that to a very specific use case. So solving AI for knowledge retrieval, or solving AI for an enhanced chatbot on the website that's going to give accurate information out to my customers. Those are different use cases that require different sets of ecosystems and services, and hardware provisioning at the end of the day. What I've also learned is that you mentioned scale. Not everything is massive banks of GPUs. And I'm seeing this, and we kind of touched on this earlier, is traditional AI, and I'm quite sure when I had to start phrasing that in that way, but traditional AI, machine learning, computer vision, especially, like that doesn't require banks of GPUs. It requires some CPUs. It probably requires them out at the edge. So the way we're seeing AI being dispersed across an organization has been fascinating to me, whether it's just, I need a new laptop that has Copilot enabled, or I need some processing out in every single one of our stores so we can take that camera feed and actually get some intelligence and some value out of that, traditional kind of very legacy data that we might review after the fact and look at some things, versus those, okay, I'm going to buy 1,000 servers with a ton of GPUs, and I'm going to train my own model. There's some of that happening. I'd like to see more of it happening in Canada, but to me, the fascination has been across the board at different scales, but it has to be a focus on the ecosystem in connection with the hardware. Again, we can make it as easy as possible to solve specific use cases. That's what's causing success, rather than a bunch of POCs that aren't driving the value that the business is looking for.
Could I jump in on that? There's a chicken and egg problem right now with AI, and I'll pick on some of the more mainstream language models and things like that. Is they have a capability that could do a lot of things, but then the end user wants to know, well, what? And so it requires, good AI requires a very specific use case when we're talking about applying these large language models. I don't think that most people need a chatbot. I don't think that the chatbot model, I think it's actually done an incredible disservice to the potential, because it's put forward a mode of interaction that is too unspecific, and I think it's almost corrupted the conversation of the potential. It's good that it's put it in the public domain. If people are thinking about it, they're kind of aware of it. But then it comes down to, okay, how do you get to that specific use case? Well, what do you need? What do you want? What do you need? What do you want? So we're sort of going back and forth. I think this, I talked to IBM yesterday, and they called it the POC purgatory, or prototype purgatory. I like that term. I don't know if it's an IBM term. I hope not. But this idea of, you're caught in this cycle of trying to figure it out and test it. And so I think that's natural. I think that's where we're going to be for a couple of years. But what's going to happen is we're going to start to go towards, okay, this is what the technology is really good at, and this is what you need to steer clear. And that's where we need that community of practice thinking, where people coming together and sharing those things. Like we tried it for whatever, financial forecasting, rubbish, but we tried it for policy interpretation and retrieval, fantastic. And so if we start to, lay out, you could do this with a business capability mapping, right? Almost every organization, at least in government, does business capability canvas of what they do. You could overlay the different generative AI models on top of that, and you could heat map it and say, it's not really good for this, but it's excellent for that, and start to get into that. And that would completely demystify for people how to start to utilize these things, and when to call in a vendor, when to just use a language model yourself, and things like that. I think those are the kinds of insights we need to start sharing and co-developing, and it's going to really drive a much more productive conversation, rather than, it's a panacea that can do everything. It's not, but it's also not nothing. It's also significant. And there's a lot of people out there who consider it to be a grift or a scam. And yeah, it'll fail at a bunch of use cases, but, the practitioners know it's more than that, but no one's been able to really articulate a true mapping yet on what it's really good at. And so you kind of need like, a language model Olympics, where you can compete these different models, you can put them into different categories, you can pick the gold, you can pick the bronze, and then people can understand it. You put it in ordinary terms, and people have a much more constructive conversation about it.
I won't disagree, but the chatbot thing is an interesting one to me, because I see that as a very common use case for a lot of different organizations.
Right.
And I agree that we have a habit of bucketizing Gen AI into, well, all it can do is a chatbot. And I actually see those chatbots as a stepping stone to the next evolution. And I still think it's important, because I have this all the time personally. Every time I go to a website
Right.
where I don't want to click on a filter or type in a search or
Right.
try and narrow down the answer. I just want the answer to my question. And I don't want to have to use the existing quote unquote chatbot to do that, because my time spent on that chatbot is what do I have to say
Right.
in order to get to a real person that can actually answer my question. So I think it's easy to layer that on now, as long as you do it carefully with some guardrails and we make sure that it's not making things up. But where I think that's ultimately going is towards things like AI agents, where
Yes.
it's no longer a chatbot, it's an agent that's solving a specific problem for me. So I don't go to a chatbot, I go to an AI agent that's able to disseminate and find the information and come back to me with something intelligent.
Right.
But I do think if we could just blanket the web with intelligent chatbots rather than the pick a path that we've got today, I would consider that somewhat a success.
Right.
But I think the biggest thing is listen to the end users, listen to how people want it implemented.
Right.
Because if you go and do this in a vacuum and you go, okay, we've decided as a business this is where it fits, and you haven't listened to the people, they'll go, to your point, I don't need a chatbot. It's not Copilot that would solve my problem.
Right.
It's if you could do this, and we go, oh, well, we can easily do that. We probably should have asked you before we started implementing this system. So I think it's a means to an end, but I think it's an important one.
Yeah, and I think when I look at it, it's an outcome-based conversation. It's like, what are we really trying to do?
Sure.
And I'm going to set this up for you, James, because I think, as Janek was talking, one of the interesting things for me is the way in which you've sort of framed the proof of productivity. And so, we talk about a proof of concept, or we talk about, being able to look at a concept and then judge whether or not it created value. Maybe we do a proof of value. But when we look at the outcome, a lot of times with generative AI, we're looking at a way to improve productivity. We talked about that. So could you maybe explain that as a concept and kind of how that differs from maybe our traditional POV or POC?
Yeah, so to me, it's the first question I ask, to your point on an outcome-driven conversation, is what do we actually want to achieve at the end of this? So once we've implemented the AI system, are we expecting the service desk to be able to take 20% more calls? Like, is there a metric we can put to the implementation of this AI system before we even start, so that we know it's been successful? And I think you have to ask that question up front. And I think if you can't define that, if you can't say, this is the actual metric that I expect to be improved by the implementation of this, is this where we should start for this AI implementation? Because I'm seeing no shortage of, and I've had this lots of times, I'll have a general conversation about just like this with a customer on where AI is going. I'll leave the meeting, and then the customer will send me a long list of 100 AI projects they've got across the business. And I'll say, okay, well, which of those is realistic to do? Because this one over here sounds fantastic, but that's going to take you 3 years. And which ones are realistic and which ones are going to have the biggest business impact, and quantify that. Actually be able to say, this is the impact that AI system is going to have on the business. And we have to start there, because I like the IBM phrase, I may steal that, but we have to get to this moving away from proof of concepts to moving towards proof of value. Because if we can't do that, we're missing out on a huge opportunity. Because I do think the opportunity is real. I do think the impact of AI is real. I don't believe we're going to hit a big trough in the hype cycle, because we've had a chance to play with it. It's not like, oh, I've heard this is good. No, I've seen it's good.
Right.
Again, I always give the example, if you go into ChatGPT and ask it a question that you know nothing about, you are amazed by the output. You're like, wow, this is fantastic. And then you ask it a question you know a huge amount about, and you start to temper your expectations, because it's maybe not perfect, but that's a general algorithm. It's not something that was designed to be specific and to aid the business. So I am a big proponent of moving these towards proof of value. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And if I don't ever have to click a sublink in a search ever again, I would love that. And obviously, you want the content creators that are making the news stories or whatever to be remunerated for that. But but I'm tired of playing the click which link, and which link has the answer, and scanning pages of text to get that, whether it's an internal document or an external web page. So I definitely, and I think framing it in a sense of how much more effective can I make this task is really important as well. I think when we start thinking about the agents, it's almost like, well, we're each wearing a dozen different hats during the given day. If I can take that one hat and I can make that job easier, so I can spend more time with some of these other roles that I have, empowering that agent to be able to do that. I think you're right. I think that's where we really start to see that value.
If I could just jump in on the agent thing for a moment. It's going to require such a seismic shift in how we think about things. Right now, we are fixated on this human operating machine mindset when it comes to using computers, right? If I want to know something, I put it upon myself to go into Google and to find the information and to screen it and to read it and evaluate it and pluck that piece of information back, copy, paste, put it in Word, put it in a deck, right? I am operating a interface to do a task, but it's still limited to a non-scalable me. Mm-hmm. Instead, you have to start to think about communicating the outcome you want to achieve. I'm curious about this topic. I need my agent to go off asynchronously. Again, this is one of the things that we rely on. You sit at your keyboard and you want those tokens to just pound down your screen in real time. I don't really need that. It's nice to know that, they're getting faster and they're getting smarter, whatever. What I really need is a correct, trustworthy, deep answer that takes into maybe 100 or 1,000 different resources, not just the top 3 links.
Yeah.
So, if I'm curious about, I want to figure out what's keeping the CFO up at night, thinking about how to, manage operating expenses in the cloud or something like that. So I don't want, and this is where I was sort of, maligning the chatbot experience, is the chatbot lacking deep context of what you're attempting to do will give you a superficial answer that is unsatisfactory in depth.
Yes.
Instead, I want a deep answer that's reasoned and sourced that I can then think about. So the action that I want to take is I don't want to go to Google and hit results. I don't want to go to ChatGPT and get tokens like a paragraph. I want to say, you know what? I know I have to talk to the CFO this afternoon. So you go off this morning and you find and reason yourself through a set of tasks. You tell me your methodology. You create a web map of everywhere that you went and create a bibliography. And you come back and give me a medium length, reasoned, valuable answer that educates me and it puts the context of my organization central to how the information is being presented. And now I can go forward and have a reasonable and responsible conversation with the CFO. It's a completely different experience. That's what I would do if I was working with another coworker. And I'd say, hey, KJ, can you go off and look into that and, do a bit of research and come back and give a presentation? I don't expect you to have it done in a fraction of a second. I expect that it to be good and not to be perfect, though. I expect it to be a good initial draft. We'll have a conversation. We'll refine it together. That's a complete mindset shift. And that's why, the chat, again, I don't mind a text interface. I love speaking in my own language and communicating it, but it needs to know a lot about me in order to give me a reasonable response. It's like, oh, you're a cardiologist. Okay, now I have a concept around the depth of how you want the answer, not like describing the valves of the heart, right? Like, I know you know that now because I know you're a cardiologist. Now I'm going to go off and find you something that's much more cutting edge. And just to wrap the point, as you start to load in a bit of who you are, you start to be able to communicate, I want to expand my knowledge, or I want to go deep on existing knowledge. Those are 2 completely different search retrieval methodologies, if you will. So, what kind of person are you? Are you a person who wants to go deep on a subject or broad on multiple subjects? That's going to give you a completely different set. So that's why chatting is insufficient. It doesn't, imagine it from the AI's perspective. If I'm not anthropomorphizing these things, but if you were to imagine it sitting on the other side, it doesn't know anything about you. It's just receiving a question. It's it couldn't know. You couldn't know, you blindfolded in a dark room who you're talking to, then it can't either. And so, it's just we have to start to instill new mindsets of interaction with these technologies, or we're just not going to get it.
And I think that is, to your point, is going to take time for people to change how they think about this. Yeah. I always use the example of searching for information.
Right.
Like the way you search for something, if you go to Google or pick your favorite search engine, or you go to SharePoint, or you go to ChatGPT, you do that very differently. Your mindset is, okay, this is how I ask the question here.
Right.
I think the interesting with the last one is I'm just using my own natural language to do that search.
Right.
And I think that has value to the organization. I think that's a piece that's missed a lot, is if my end users are now asking me as an organization how to do something, how to solve something, what to buy, if they're doing it using natural words and they're not taking into account how I am presenting it to them, it's a huge amount of valuable market knowledge to me.
Yes.
What I found fascinating here is there's a whole study of what's called cyborg anthropology, which is the impact that technology has on people and how people respond and change to technology. I think the big thing that AI is going to drive eventually is it's democratizing access to information in a way that doesn't require you to be a technical expert.
Right.
That doesn't require you to I'm great at PowerPoint because I'm a whiz on how that program functions.
Right.
If I take all that requirement away from an individual, I think it's huge potential for this to impact everybody.
Yes.
Like if I'm a cardiologist, it's assumed that I have a certain background, and when I'm asking questions of an assistant, they know that, and so I think part of the challenge that I think we see with chatbots and that interface is not being able to get that specific answer, get that specific information, because we are not also explaining those assumptions to the tool that we're using. And it was interesting is I was talking with some of our newly joined CDW employees, and they were talking, it's great, where they were trying to build some presentations, they were working in PowerPoint, and they were learning about the customers they were trying to talk to, using ChatGPT, and say, hey, give me a summary about this,
right.
And then say, okay, well, I want to take these topics, so help me build a presentation around these topics. And I said, also tell the chatbot who you're communicating to, because if you're communicating to the CFO or the CIO or the CEO or the systems admin, you're going to want to communicate in a different way. You're going to want to frame things. There's different values that those different roles will have.
Context is king still.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
So I think one of the challenges that we have is that by not including that information, who is the target audience? What is our base of understanding?
That's right.
And then also to your point, having the data available is key as well, because some of that intern is not just going to go do a Google search. They're also going to look through your internal documentation.
Right.
So if you are not safeguarding and presenting data so that it can be looked at by those chatbots, you're short-circuiting your ability to be targeted for your organization, right?
That's
so,
and this is today why prompt engineering is a term and a thing. I think eventually that's going to disappear, but right now people have learned to do some of that. They said, okay, before you answer the question, take on the persona of answer the question as, and the more you get used to doing that prompt engineering, the better your results are going to get. I think to the point we were making earlier, as these models become more contextually aware, as they're designed for very specific purposes rather than being general, some of that requirement starts to disappear, and I'm hoping that we don't all need to become prompt engineers in order to use these systems effectively.
No, but if we apply thinking about how we would just work with each other. So James, if you said to me, hey, I need to make a presentation, the very first words out of my mouth wouldn't be, sure, I can help you with that. Here's your presentation template. I'd say, well, who are you presenting to?
Yeah.
Right. And also, who are you? And also, like, what do you want to get out of it? And like, these are these contextual elements that we rely on this tacit knowledge of, we make assumptions that person, like, because I know something about that person, that's the manager of IT, I can go have a manager of IT appropriate conversation with that person. But if they're the manager of HR, I'm not going to speak to them at all those ways. And so, you mentioned wearing multiple hats. I think we forget that we speak multiple languages amongst contexts. Even go talk to your children or your spouse the way you talk at work, and they'll say, "What's wrong with you? Like, why are you speaking like this?" and so we have this ability to wear different personas ourselves. And it's sort of a human capability to do that. So if we forget that that's a foundation to having productive conversations with each other, we're not going to have productive conversations with AI unless we take the time to maybe crystallize some of that knowledge. So when I log in, it knows something about me to start the conversation, and you cut through 99% of that generic crap that it's giving you. And so, those are going to be the things that start to push system performance and unlock the capabilities. We haven't seen it yet. The common perception, it's not, that's why I was kind of maligning again, the chat concept of it is chat in itself is this very casual thing. I was on the bus, I chatted with somebody.
Yeah.
But we chatted about superficial things because I really knew nothing about them. And maybe I gained some knowledge at the end of the bus ride, but probably not. Whereas, I would sit and have a deep conversation with people while we're driving towards an outcome. But if we don't know that outcome, we can't have a conversation maybe. No, yeah. So, it's a mindset shift. It's going to take, it's going to be a generational thing for us to, and I don't mean that in the kind of like aging people out. I just mean it's going to take typically 20 years for us to, there's this 20-year window where it takes to really contend with new things. And I think it's going to take a period of time for us to adapt.
Yeah. And I think it definitely, at the rate of change, is also going to be a moving target too. Like we may get comfortable with parts of it. That's 10, right. 20 years from now. There's still other things we won't.
Yes. And I think that's some of the fear. I think that's what's driving people is the speed of it.
Yeah.
Right. Like if I know that I can learn, okay, fine. But if I know that there's a rate to which I can learn and this technology is going faster than I can learn, that's scary.
Yeah. And I think the speed is real. Like it doesn't take 4 years to go from idea to product anymore. Yeah. I can do it in months potentially, and I can get AI to aid me on that way. And I think we're going to see a very rapid progression of this technology because the technology itself helps me do that rapid progression. So yeah, I can understand why some people are a little bit scared. I think some of that comes down to there's the assumption that we're about to hit AGI and we're going to have some artificial general intelligence that knows everything. We're not. I think we're a long way away from that. But that to me is one of the interesting differentiators here. We've got the public who have that perception, and then we've got businesses who are very cautious and like, I'm going to implement this very slowly because I'm worried about what it's going to do and how it's going to react and how I need to train my people. And there's a risk of that gap widening over time if we don't move a little bit faster. But I do think, and I have far more conversations on ethics and frameworks and the impact to individuals than I do on can you size a Llama 3 model for me for this token rate. Far more in the first category than the second.
And those are great conversations to have. I think we haven't really gone down the ethics piece. I'd love to dig into it a little bit in this conversation if there's time. But I think we need to be having, I think there's a spectrum of ethical considerations. And, as part of the, I suppose, becoming proficient in the language of this technology is about becoming proficient in the ethical concerns and considerations of people.
Yeah, and so we'll kind of pivot to that because I want to talk a little bit about trust.
Yes.
But one thing I want to mention to your point around just having this become part of our way of life. Or I was sitting on the airplane. I was having a conversation. We were talking about AI, and the person I was talking to. They were a little bit younger than me. I don't know how much younger.
Sure.
But I just brought up, when I was in school, it was frowned upon to use calculators to do math. Until we got into calculus and there was like some very complex things happening, the expectation was you did everything longhand, you wrote it all out. I think if you went to a school today and said, hey, there's this tool you could use, it's called a calculator, but we're not going to let you use it. You'd probably get some really funny looks. And so I think as we go forward, AI as a tool that's just integrated into how we do things. And maybe that does take, a generational change to do that. But regarding trust, so I think as we look at technologies, as we look at trying to transition from something that we use maybe begrudgingly, and then we use hesitantly, and eventually we kind of get into being able to use a tool and see more value, and then really get excited about using that tool. I think trust is one of those things. And the setup for this is I have a friend that was trying to figure out if they'd made the investment in the right self-driving automobile. And what they did is they actually took a part-time job delivering pizzas, and they tested out the effectiveness of self-driving by giving the car agency to drive them to all of these locations. And they did this for 3 months. They just wrapped up with their test, and they said, you know what, it's pretty good at it. And so, part of this trust in new technologies is going to be, that sort of trust fall. Like how do we get to the point where we can feel confident that we're getting good information? I think we feel pretty good about traditional AI. I think where we deploy computer vision, where we deploy, medical scanning, I think we feel very good that it's deterministic. It's really good at giving us valid information that we can action. And really with those, it's how do we make it better? How do we go from 95% to 97% is kind of the thing. With generative AI, I think, as you pointed out, hallucinations, there's, we have these broad general models. What level of trust do you feel that we should have for generative AI? And then how do we proceed forward to make the tools better so that we can have more trust in them?
I think trust is the defining challenge that will stand between the capability and the adoption. So just as you say, I don't believe I've not seen anyone come up with a comprehensive trust framework in terms of all of the facets of trust. I think the key thing is trust to do what? And so that requires specificity on the use case. It requires context around the working environment, and it even requires context around the stakes. So if we've accepted, and you talked about, I've been on a few planes recently, you talked about your flight over. We've accepted that we trust airlines and pilots and mechanics to a certain amount that is less than 100%. Now, it has to be pretty close to 100%. It has to be as close as humanly possible to 100%. But we still get on in the plane, and we still understand that airline accidents do happen. So I would say that there is almost no situation where human capability is trusted at a pure 100%. But the threshold could be quite high. Now, it varies, right? If you say, hey, can I get that PowerPoint presentation by this afternoon, and I get it to you by tomorrow morning, that could have a major impact, or, whatever, right? You close enough. You got it within a couple of hours of when I needed it. And so, from that standpoint, trusting to do what? We have to get really specific about what we're doing. And then when we're getting into evaluating these use cases, I do think that there are objective means of evaluating these models in specific domains and coming up with assessments. So you can, you talked about before the thing, the strawberry challenge, how many R's in strawberry, right? And so that's a common thing that they get wrong. Well, that seems ludicrous that you would trust that machine to make a decision. But you have to consider you're asking it the wrong question, and you're leaning on its weakness, not its strength. If you said, write me a deterministic algorithm that computes the number of specific letters in a string, run that algorithm and provide me the results of it, 100% of the time, it will get the answer right. And so you're asking, so you're sort of, asking it the wrong question and giving it the wrong set of instructions. And so if you had a use case of being a proofreader or an editor or something like that, you wouldn't just rely on the probabilistic matching of, the latent space and the vectors aligning and whatever. You would say, look, you are an editor. I want you to do a very careful word-by-word analysis on this 1,000,000-word manuscript, and I want you to run it through a deterministic process to do that. And it will get that right, again, 100% of the time. And all you would need to do if you wanted a human in the mix is someone to check the logic before you deploy it against a large use case. And so, the trust aspect, people have to stop just wanting to trust these things to be great at everything. But that also requires that person to be much more clear about what they're actually asking it to do. Because there is, I did the Alice in Wonderland problem. I don't know if you've seen it. It's similar to the strawberry problem. Alice has M brothers and n sisters. And so how many brothers how many sisters does Alice's brother have, right? So Alice herself falls into the set of sisters.
Yeah.
And it typically gets it wrong. It typically says, well, it would have, Alice's brother would have the same number of sisters as Alice has, but it forgets that Alice again, this is tacit knowledge. We're assuming that you're associating the name Alice with a female. So that's tacit knowledge right there. That's mistake number one. But then, so if it fails at the answer. It always says the same. It almost always says Alice's brother has the same. But if you say calculated algorithmically and write me the formula for it, it 100% of the time gets the answer correct. So as you are mapping out its capabilities, you can say, when you reach these kinds of problems, don't try to answer it as a language problem. Try to answer it as a math problem. And so you're going to end up with, what I predict is you're going to end up with pockets of capability that are approaching 100%. And you're going to then bring those together and orchestrate them together into a general understander, a general interface you're talking to, and very specialized capabilities underneath. I don't think you're going to get a single model that's AGI and a single model that you can ever trust. I think you're going to get layers of building more and more and more trust down. So the first thing that says, well, who are you and why do you want to know how many sisters Alice's brother has? Well, this is a word problem. Oh, okay. If it's a word problem, I'm going to pass it on to this other model. And it's been trained at word problems, or it's been trained at thinking through things kind of from an algorithmic or arithmetic standpoint. And so then we're going to overcome these issues, and we're going to get to that heightened level of trust. But we can't keep, the last thing that I'll say is, we've not culturally implemented a system of evaluating how much we trust each other either. Like if you wanted to know how trustworthy people are, you'd have to keep score, and you'd have to have fact check everything that James and KJ and Janek says, right? And so we don't do that. We apply a certain amount of trust but verify. If you tell me something, I'm going to say, oh, that's really interesting. I trust that you're giving me something valuable, but then what do I go? I'm going to go and check the official reference. I'm going to go look up that thing on the internet. I'm going to go ask my doctor. I'm not going to take medical information from the person I see on the bus. And so you have to then, what you're building is a system of trust. And so the AI can come in and give you indicative direction. And then you can then have a system of trust of trustworthy references that round out the information. And again, this system, you have to think systems and stop thinking models in here. And I think you'll be able to build a trust framework that is transparent. It's interoperable, so you'll be able to share it between organizations, and it's statistically demonstrable. So I'll be able to run it 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, and give you a statistical proof that I can publish that this system is sufficient for this use case. And again, are we looking for 100%, or are we looking for as good or better than we are? And that's not 100% for anything that we do.
I was going to say, it's an interesting one. I'm going to come back to the airline analogy again, because I had a colleague make this analogy the other week.
Sure.
This is a bit like fly-by-wire. Like when that first got introduced, pilots felt like, well, I'm losing control here. I can no longer feel the airline in the same way that I can now. It's all computerized.
Right.
But we get to a point eventually where enough systems fly. I do this enough times. I start to trust it.
Sure.
I think some of that is this. You made the point earlier of demonstrating where it got the answer from.
Right.
I think a lot of that is going to happen for now. So here's the answer because I found it in this document or as part of this video. I think we are still in a phase where, great, now I'm going to go and check that those sources actually exist, because there's a very famous case where a lawyer had it draft a response and it just made up a ton of references that did not exist. So for now, we're at that phase of I'm going to check these references exist. Eventually, we'll get to the point where, okay, it's sourced them. That's enough trust for me. I think eventually we'll get to the point where I don't need it to show me the source. If I want it, I can get it. It's just going to take time for us to, again, the systems to get better so that they aren't making things up, to your point, narrowing them down their focus. And I love the analogy of we're invaluable. we shouldn't expect the systems to be better. Should we maybe expect them, and our self-driving cars are a great one, should we expect them to be better than people? I would hope eventually, yes.
Yeah.
But that's on the assumption, I think, that every vehicle on the road is at that state.
Yeah.
Because at that point, I think the one I'm concerned about is the one that has a human behind the wheel. But again, that takes a lot of trust to sit in a car
Right.
and have the car drive and have no one hold the steering wheel.
Right.
That's going to take a mindset shift more than a technology one.
And I just wanted to say, like, we trust them to do different things, right? So do I trust the self-driving car to be perfect? I want it to be pretty good, but I also am pretty confident that it's not going to drink, and it's not going to take drugs, and it's not going to do other things. But it could also get hacked. Well, but the human driver could also be distracted on their phone, but it won't get distracted on its phone. So what we're talking about is and why I think that there's such good synergies between people and AI is they can offset their deficiencies, right? It's just like like a computer, we'll say, is it as smart as a person? Well, in some aspects, it has completely infallible memory. It never forgets anything. It can retrieve billions of records in a moment. I can't even, that's several orders of magnitude beyond what any person can do. Mm-hmm. But in concert with a human, oh, wow, you have a capability that you didn't have before. And so again, stop looking at it to be the same as, but look at how you fill each other's gaps. Maybe I get distracted or I get a little drowsy on the drive home, and the self-driving car takes over, or it pulls into the coffee shop and refills my coffee for me. It's like, hey man, I'm doing this for you. And that could get somewhat dystopian and scary to some degree as well. But it's possible. I do believe it's possible to get there from a trust standpoint. It's going to require us again to be much more aware and conscious of what we do. And this is an interesting, thing just to wrap up my piece on this is when I sit and talk to business units and they say, hey, can AI help me with this? And I'll say, well, can you explain what you do in the job? And they can, but it's not, it's a lot more up here than it is documented anywhere. And often it requires a person to sit with a business analyst for a couple of days and really map out what they do, because they're not necessarily consciously thinking about a process that they do. And so it forces you to be, I guess, less tacit in your knowledge and more self-aware, which if that's the only outcome, that's maybe not a bad thing either.
Yeah, that's a really good point too. There's also, I think, when you get to that point where you start to document what somebody does, then there's also that inkling in the back of the head: am I doing this to improve my productivity with a tool, or am I doing this because potentially I'm being replaced or outsourced? And so I think you run into that. The short answer to your question about what does it take to get somebody into a driverless vehicle is apparently the novelty and $5 off of your ride share. Because I did that in Phoenix, and that's what it was the novelty of being in a driverless car, and they offered me a $5 discount. So now, and to your point again, I had it. I think it was the last podcast we were talking with the web AI team, and they mentioned, it depends on what time of day you get me.
Sure.
It's not just it could be I haven't had a cup of coffee yet, and my synapses are not going yet, and so you catch me first thing in the morning, or you catch me middle of the afternoon, you're potentially going to get very, very different responses from me. So we talked about the trust side of things and a little bit about how we can go out that. There's also the ethical side of things.
Yes.
So I'm going to move on to some other questions, but I wanted to touch on that too, because I think it's not just around the ethics of what we're doing with the data, but also how we're generating the models that we're using. And you mentioned earlier, being able to have sort of assessments of those. And one of the projects that I check in with every once in a while is Stanford has their Helm holistic evaluation for language models, where they actually go in and look at data bias and they look at toxicity and things like that. Being able to quantify that is good. But how do we start to look at sort of the ethical side of using AI, of leveraging data for training? Where are you guys looking at that, and how does that play into your decision making?
There's several dimensions of ethics. when you're looking at these things. There's the ethics of what the purpose for what you're applying it. So I think that, like any technical tool, you can use it for good or for bad. I think that organizations should be clear about what they want to achieve and why. If you're looking at, I'm doing this because I want to radically reduce my overhead and lay off 80% of my staff, that's a deeply ethical conversation you can start to have, and you have to start to get into the Simon Sinek, start with why, right? Why are you using this tool? So I think that that's true for various types of technology. What I would say is, there's a big ethical question around the source of the training data.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't aware until recently of any foundational models that provided provenance on their training data, and I think that that's probably the biggest risk for these models is how do we deploy something where there are open questions around copyright infringement, mm-hmm. around the IP that went into it. There was the Lex Friedman podcast came out, and yesterday or 2 days ago, and the guy was saying, all these great generative AI solutions, no one talks about it, but they're all trained on pornography to get human anatomy right. And so it's like, is that an ethical source for what we want to feed into it? And I think in the next 2 to 5 years, we're going to have a whole number of these major AI creators and foundational model creators going to court and working these things through in both the court of public opinion, but also the legal system mm-hmm. in their jurisdiction, as to say, is this fair use of copyrighted material? When I look at it I think that's a risk, certainly from a government usage of some of these technologies. I would be very keenly interested to talk to any vendors who have complete traceability on the ethical sourcing of their models. I'm not advocating one vendor over any other. I'm interested in all of them, but I spoke to IBM, I just mentioned. They have their Granite model where they have traceability. And so they're smaller models. They're, a 7 billion parameter model, which is kind of considered at the smaller edge of it. They have various models. But if you get organizations who have less capable models, but can come forward with a clear ethical framework of how they've been created, how they're sourced, what data is in there, and what safeguards they've put in against bias and hate speech and all those other things, I think that, they may not be the most capable cutting edge models on the marketplace, but with such an open ethical set of questions and legal questions, they're certainly, from a government perspective, very interesting. Mm-hmm. I would take safe, clean, legal, ethical models that I could deploy on limited use cases, generally speaking, over maybe more capable models that have a bit of a dodgy reputation or are unclear about how they're being created. So I think that's a huge one. I do think that there's a bunch of folks that I've been engaging with through LinkedIn and such who are quite negative, bearish on the AI. They see it as a bit of a grift, that the capability doesn't exist, and then they also raise the ethical conundrum, some of which I just talked about. I think that I don't buy the argument that the capability doesn't exist. The capability is absolutely there. Mm-hmm. But I do buy the argument that we haven't really figured out how to tap into the best capabilities that don't have some pretty significant ethical dilemmas. So the way I'm looking at it from an evaluation standpoint, I want to use the latest and greatest models because I want to see where the technology is going. But I may not choose to deploy those models and use them to help Canadians and serve Canadians because the ethical problems are still significant. Now to put a pin in the sourcing piece of it, from my perspective, there's enough data out there that's either open source or ethically sourced or that you can bring in, that I don't buy the argument that you can't build highly capable models with ethical data. I just think that what we're seeing is a real race towards this imaginary victory of AGI or ASI. And so I think that there's, these organizations are pursuing something that's not very clearly defined. I think, though, what they've proven with the technology is that there is an appetite and there's a capability, and I think we should double back. We should loop back and figure out how to do these things properly after we figured out how to do them disruptively. And it's almost like we're in the Napster period, if you will, where Napster effectively proved the Spotify model before it existed and the Apple Music model before it existed. So you had something that was wildly popular, that was, it did not stand the test of time from a legal perspective, and it was ultimately shut down. But it proved a shift in mindset around music, that people wanted a much larger library. They wanted to stream it. They wanted it on demand. They wanted many more genres than they could get at their record store. They didn't want to carry physical media. And so it proved something that then other organizations come in and build, robust business models around and are able to deliver something of high value. So I do think we're sort of in that phase. And so I would caution my counterparts and others in government to just be cautious about how you're applying it. And I would really want to invite industry to come in and say, help us solve this problem, because we know these models are capable. We know that there's a lot of potential here. But, with this dark cloud, if you will, hanging over the provenance and the sourcing of these models, it's going to become difficult to get the gains that we're looking for.
I think the other challenge here is that most organizations are not in a position to build and train their own models.
Yeah.
So the transparency of where the model came from is important.
Yes.
But when that comes to implementation, and we see a huge demand right now for things like RAG models, where I'm taking this fairly general model and I'm going to provide it my information in order to make it a little bit more specific without the huge compute overhead of training.
Yes.
That then brings in the other side of that ethical dilemma, which is, okay, I might be able to in the future maybe prove some provenance of where that I'll say the Gen AI smoothing of my internal resources comes from. That then turns the onus back on me to say, here is how I am validating the bias of the material that I am feeding into the model personally. Sure. And I think there's two challenges there. One is having that level of confidence in the information I'm feeding it to start with. So if as an organization I have got some bias in my previous dealings, and it's going to be reflected in the model that I end up not training, again, without being specific on terminology. But the other side of that, and I'm seeing a couple of organizations focus on this right now, is monitoring my use for bias over time. So my initial implementation, great. I've done all the sourcing, I've validated it, I've cleaned it all up, I've done everything I can to try and make sure that the outputs from this model are not going to have maybe the bias that we have, to your point on maybe holding them the same standards that we do, or hopefully better. But how is that going to change over time? And monitoring my models for drift is a concern. And you mentioned that trust but verify, that suddenly pings a whole bunch of security things in my head, and moving towards zero trust and the change in mindset there. The other concern here is that attackers changing that source. That suddenly becomes a very ripe target for the attackers to come in and say, I'm going to make it so that your model starts producing the information that it should not be not be producing. I think the final point on this, and it kind of loops back into the conversation earlier on trust, is it's easy when I have a database of systems. I can go in and look at the columns and the rows, and I can visually make an understanding of what's going on in the system and where any concern might be. When I take all of that and I create a vector database that my model is going to feed on, I can't look at a vector database and go, okay, I understand how it's coming to the conclusion it has.
Yeah.
Now there are systems and ways of making it trace back.
Yeah.
But we have to account for that. We have to account for that from a trust, and we have to account for it from an ethics perspective. And I think moving forward, the monitoring of my systems for concerns in this is a huge gap right now that nobody is doing that today outside of it. I said a couple of niche vendors.
I think AI could do it. Could it self-monitor in the sense of, I'm going to detect that there was a change in my foundational data, And anyway, it's an interesting loop problem.
I think it is. Yeah, and I think it's again, I've got my security hat on.
Yeah.
Could I use that in and of itself as a way to prevent a system from working? So we kind of end up kind of almost DDoSing ourselves if we're not careful in these models.
Yeah, it is a valid point when you start to think about as bad actors have used supply chain attacks as opposed to direct attacks, injecting code, could it be injecting data or one of the security tactics that I think we don't do enough of is it's really hard to take data. It's really hard to malign data if it's just not there. And so you get back to the point about what data has been used to train the model.
Yes.
And did we were we judicious enough in the data we used in the creation process in the first place?
And there's actually a great, and I forget the name of the tool now, but it was a kind of a proof of concept where you could, in order to protect your intellectual property rights, you could encode behind the image some information that would alter the training algorithm if it was fed on those images. So someone took a set of pictures of dogs. To a human, they still look like dogs. But if you fed them into the training algorithm and you said, okay, draw me a picture of a dog, it would draw a picture of a cat. Because of the way they've manipulated the data that, again, we can't see that's part of that image. So that comes back to your point of what were you trained on and how much do I trust the source of the material that you were trained on? But it does start to get into the ethics of, is it okay for me to do that on the output of what I'm producing as an individual to prevent my content from being used to train models moving forward?
And you're seeing attacks on open source intelligence in the sense that if I know that you're scraping the internet, without being judicious about where you're sourcing this information, and I can go and pollute the well, where I can say, hey, here's 1,000 articles about James that, maybe it's enough, and maybe I just use different people, but it's enough that I know it's going to tip it over and be like, he's kind of I found 1,000 articles, maybe it's, you don't get your security clearance, or, that person, whatever. So if you can attack the source information, interesting times ahead. But there have been, this is documented already, where even if you take AI out of the mix, like I can just put enough information out there so that a search algorithm is going to, increase your risk score or something like that.
Is it that different from manipulating my search results to get me to the top of the search list? Could I do it so that
SEO? That's what it is, right?
Are we heading into a world where that's the new race? How do I make sure that my content is not just human readable from a marketing perspective, but it's got enough manipulation in the back end so that every time an LLM asks a question on technology, it comes back with the result I wanted to come back with. I think that's going to be an interesting future.
And to your point around like bias drift, as more publicly available content has been generated or partially generated via AI, that becomes a whole different can of worms.
Synthetic data, but before we synthetic systems,
exactly. But delivered as an authoritative response, and potentially an authoritative hallucination. So real quick though, James, we would talk a little bit about sort of safety versus innovation. How are you finding organizations approach the safety versus innovation with generative AI, and then how do we sort of tilt that more towards the innovation side of things?
So I think it's an interesting challenge right now. I'm seeing, as I said earlier, a lot of organizations are very hesitant because maybe they are putting that, and I don't think wrongly, the safety concerns first. We want to make sure that we're implementing this in a responsible, ethical, trustworthy way, which makes perfect sense. I've talked to colleagues in the EU, and because of some of their rules and regulations, they're already starting to see organizations, reduce their effort or back off, or not put the investments in that space because they're concerned that those rules are maybe tilted too much the other way to kind of, I don't want to say stifle innovation, because I do think those rules are required, and I think they're going to be required everywhere. The challenge is you can absolutely put those rules and regulations in a way that does stifle and prevent innovation. And I think this is a global problem. And the challenge with doing that at a local level is you may end up putting your organization or your country at a disadvantage through those rules. So I don't have a clear answer for you. I think that everyone is trying to hunt for this answer right now. But I actually think, and I say this half jokingly, but I think it's accurate. In Canada, we do tend to be slightly more cautious with new technology. I've seen it in the past. As I said, I used to do a lot of work in the cloud space, and we were definitely behind from versus the US perspective in that area. I think we're going to do the same thing with AI. But I also think, just like with cloud, it actually puts us in an advantage because we've got a lot of lessons learned that we can pull from prior to that implementation.
Yeah.
All of what we're talking about, if you talk about the ethics, if you talk about the trust, if you talk about security, what we're really describing is the thing that I think people are somewhat hungry for, and I'll put myself in that category, is a deeper understanding of how these things are getting, these generative AI systems are getting created, and being much more transparent about the whole thing, right? We have they're very opaque, these companies who are putting these things out currently. How did you do it? What was your data? What was your method? What am I really interacting with right now? I have no idea. Is this one model? Is this 10 models? Is this humans? Are there people? And there's a couple other layers we didn't talk about. There's the safety filters that they're putting in. So they're embedding all these layers of safety filter that limits it, and for good reason, but it limits it for, law enforcement, for example. Like if you're wanting to use these things to help you in that space, it'll say, I'm sorry, I can't help you in that space. So there's that. And then there's all the fine tuning. And this is really interesting because before anyone ever sees these models, we know that they're being fine tuned. And I find that a little bit scary in the sense of we may be leaving the best insights on ourselves and our societies and our systems off the table because we're fine-tuning them away. So I'll give you just a hypothetical example. If you go on and you say, hey, I'm interested, tell me how cold fusion would work. Now, and it gives you 10 different answers. If you fine-tune those away, be like, oh, actually, that's not true. Cold fusion is not possible. And you fine-tune that to be the correct answer. By the time somebody gets to the end user gets it, they'll say, well, tell me how cold fusion works. Well, I'm sorry, cold fusion is not possible. Well, the model didn't really believe that. It was fine-tuned to never give you those other 9 responses. And there may be deep merit and insight into those things that we simply don't see. And so if you only deploy models that are aligned to human knowledge today, you are leaving off all knowledge that is evident that maybe not be evident to any of us. And so again, you're going to be, who's fine tuning the model and with what intent. And so, certainly the different political parties accuse the others of your model is too much of this, too much of that. So it's just fun to watch. But I'm more concerned about, are we leaving insights off that we simply can't, that are just never making it to the light of day. And that's interesting as well. And so if you have a deeper insight as to what's happening there, you can kind of anticipate that. And I'm worried that we're going to, in a sense, throw the baby out with the bathwater, because we're going to want to align it to be so much like people, that it totally passes the Turing test. But if it's too much like people, it's going to be it'll have the same blind spots as people. It'll have the same the same capabilities, but also lack of capabilities. And we will say, I'm curious, and again, I have no metric to benchmark this, but I'm curious how many of the hallucinations that we've disregarded out of generative AI might have been an insight that we just lacked the frame of reference to even understand. And that's an interesting challenge as well, because we need out of the box thinking to take on social challenges, environmental challenges, economic challenges. And so, maybe we should be having models that, instead of being assistants and helpers, maybe we treat them to be our biggest critic, right?
And I think we're already seeing models that remove those filters being available on, for example, on the dark web for attackers, because they want it to generate, code that we would otherwise consider highly malicious, highly suspicious. But they need it, and it's helping them do their job, and we need to have the same.
That's right. Because if you're a white hat, and you don't have the ability to tap into those things, then suddenly you're not an effective white hat. They have a superpower that you don't have.
I shouldn't have to work around the prompts. And I gave this example to a group. I said, if I go into one of these models and I say, create me some code that will silently capture keystrokes, it'll say, I can't do that. If you say, I'm about to teach a security course on how to detect code that could you generate, it goes, absolutely, here's the code for educational purposes. So I shouldn't have to do that. We have to balance those scales out. It's a hard one.
And maybe what we're really talking about is, in different situations, having models that can perform in different ways.
Yeah.
And so, obviously, if we're going for legal advice, we want something that's got precedence. We want something that's, easily articulated, has valid sources that it's going to refer to. But you're right. If we're in an experimentation mode, and we're spitballing, then we want a different response. But I think we also want that with people,
right?
Like we all know people that are hard to convince, even with empirical evidence in front of them.
Yeah.
And we know people that are maybe way too easy to convince. and so I think what we're looking for is a model that can have a bit of a flexible mental model inside of itself, potentially, which is interesting. So we're getting close to time, but I want to talk about future state. So James, we used to say, hey, in the next 5 years, the next 10 years with AI, it's the next year and a half, 6 months, whatever, like looking way down the track, 2025. What are you excited about for what we're seeing these AI tools do, and what do you think that sort of next wave of technology is going to be?
So I kind of mentioned it already. What I'm excited about right now is just getting access to information that organizations already have, having intelligent search systems that stop me having to worry about phrasing my question correctly. If the PDF or the document or the information exists, and then an AI system that can bubble that up. It's a low-hanging fruit. That's easy. I get excited about that because I think a lot of organizations, we've been saying for years, data is your second most important asset, I would say, outside of people. But turning that data into actionable insight and knowledge has been very difficult up until recently. So that's today what I'm excited about. Where I think we're heading and I get excited about is just how we can democratize all of this AI access to people that are not tech savvy. And I mean that across two spectrums. One is I shouldn't have to be an expert in technology to get access to this, because otherwise we're going to widen the gap that already exists between different generations. And I think education, and you brought it up earlier, that's a huge topic, a very interesting one in terms of different ends of the spectrum. We have to be able to solve that. I think the other piece to this is being able to deal with people that just learn differently or speak differently or think differently. And that means obvious things like I need to be able to go into a system and ask it in any language I like. If English isn't my first language, I shouldn't be restricted to asking my questions in English. And I shouldn't be restricted because the source material was in a particular language. And I think that's critical. I also think there's huge potential in things like sign language understanding and all of that. I think has a potential to reduce the otherwise chasm that exists between people that are proficient with technology and people that aren't. That's what gets me excited. And I think education is probably the area where that applies the most. Personalized learning, the idea that someone in education can spend more time with students. And then I think, and again, this is probably an entire tangent, but the idea of saying to somebody, I'm going to assess how good you are at something by how well you can fill this form in and tick the right boxes and answer these sets of questions. We all know people that are great at answering tests and people that are not good at answering tests. Doesn't necessarily mean they don't know the material and aren't really good at it. So I think there's a huge potential to actually free up more time. Comes back to that productivity gain. To me, that is incredibly exciting. And I cannot wait to see more systems that make this possible.
Yeah, and some of the people I've talked to in education are really excited about the concept of having a tutor that's available 24/7 for every one of their students.
Yeah, I had a professor show me. He said, "Look, if I've got a student that is struggling in my topic in this particular area, if I can go into an AI system and then I go, can you tune my material with the way that this student likes to learn to aid them in this particular area of this particular topic?" And if it's able to spit out a ton of information that you can then hand to that student and say, here is a personalized lesson plan for you based on the way that you learn, I think that is huge. I think it's as we talked about earlier, a fundamental change in mind shift, though, because it comes back to I'm pretty sure maybe there still are people that were like, I'm adamant, I'm not having a calculator in my classroom because it removes your ability to do mental arithmetic. I think we are going to have a lot of people that I don't want AI anywhere near my classroom because it's removing some capabilities. I think right place, right time for the technology.
Yeah. And then Janik, when you think about FinTrack, like, what is exciting you, or where do you think we're going over the next couple of years? And what excites you about not just generative AI, but AI in general?
Well, I'll give you the more general answer first. I am excited for a couple of things. The first being, we've not yet seen. We've not yet raised up a generation of younger people through becoming AI natives, if you will. So we are applying the mindset of this technology based on what we already know for our decades in our careers. I think you're going to start to see people who are going to come and do surprising things that we don't expect out of it. And I think you're going to start to see individuals essentially showing up at a job who have brought or bought or built a veritable army of AI agents that are capable of doing what used to take 20 different people. So imagine you show up to a job and people say, well, why should I hire you for the job? Well, I am the manager of a complete capable army of these AI agents coming in and able to do, phenomenal things. And so you could task me to take on what used to be 10 people in this team, and I can do the work of 10 people. And I think that's going to drive new types of entrepreneurship for sure, right? The solopreneur is going to be able to do much more. It's also going to drive, conversations around compensation, right? Like if I can do the work of 20 people, what's my value in the organization? And again, we have to temper those things with, a voracious looking at the bottom line. We have to be conscious about, I might want that person who has this massive capability that no one's had before, but I might want that to be with all of my employees so that we can all do more. I am keenly interested in what you talked about, which is how people start to think differently when they have these tools, right? The calculator example is perfect. When my dad went to college, he bought a Tandy graphing calculator to do electronics work, and I said, you can't have that. You can't have that here. And he said, well, it fits in my pocket. I'll never be without it. Yeah. And when I went to university in 2005, I was told you cannot use CAD software to design a building. You have to do it by pencil. Which again, I understand that there's a philosophical grounding towards that, but no one builds buildings with pencils anymore. So why, it's almost the cursive writing conversation, right? So is the cursive writing a skill that exceeds the just cursive writing? Is it a mindset? Is it the ability to hold a pencil and think, haptically or whatever? We have to be more clear around why we say you can and cannot do these things. And we're kind of in that mindset with AI, right? My son's in university now, and he has to do an attestation every semester on what he will and will not do with generative AI, and it's quite limiting. And so, we've not seen the AI native people emerge yet. What we have is people that are later in their career trying to make sense of it, and we're likely getting it wrong. And so I'm super curious to see what those AI natives come up with. With respect to, if I think within the federal government at this time, I'm probably more aligned with James' answer around good knowledge retrieval. I think that is a foundational challenge that we face with the information quantity, the dispersed formats, the millions of records in our shared drives and things like that. I think it's holding us back. And so the ability to interface with corporate knowledge, I think is going to be that alone would be a multiplier on productivity. It'll get you 10 to 20% productivity gains. It'll reduce stress. It'll gain speed, and it won't displace anybody. And I think if that's the only use case that we successfully have achieved in the next 12 to 18 months or 2 years in government, I think it would have tremendous effects. And then we can still continue to explore what's the bleeding edge, what's the realm of possibility, test the latest models, but let's get the basics right. Let's get up. Let's pull ourselves up here in a way that we haven't been able to do. Let's be current with the technology, be ethical with the technology, and hit that, get RAG right, get retrieval right, get understanding policy right. It sounds silly. It's massive. Mm-hmm. And so I think, that's a fantastic use case. And more will emerge, things that we can't imagine will emerge. And maybe Canada.ca, again, don't get excited anybody, but just as a thought, Canada.ca does get replaced by a sophisticated chatbot and says, what are you really trying to do here?
Yeah.
I'm looking to immigrate to your country. I'm looking to file my taxes. I want to understand how to, do something, start a business, right? I want to start a corporation or a co-op or whatever. Okay. I want to be your agent from now on. So, I think those base use cases, don't trivialize them. They're phenomenal. They're going to have a massive positive impact, and they're going to help deliver mandate. And I think we can do that transparently, ethically, and we're going to need new tech. We talked about we're going to need new hardware, and we're going to need new mindsets. But let's get the basics right, and let's get those data people, those IM people who never get the data steward program that they want in place. Let's get those analysts who've been telling us for decades that our data is in shambles and we need to get it fixed up. Let's get the vendor community to come in and help us to categorize and organize our data, and let's apply these things. And let's, before we go on and take on the world, let's make our bedroom, right? Let's make the bed, as the expression goes. And so I think we should. I think that clearly that capability is proven itself. No one's done it yet, and so I think that's a good starting point.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned that sort of tribal knowledge and imagining joining in a new position, a new role, and having all of that tribal knowledge at your disposal, all of that information. Yeah. And then to your point around changes in the paradigm that AI is delivering. Right. Not only when we have the generation that's going to come in with AI in their back pocket, having grown up with it, but also when they enter the mentorship and the teaching side of it, again, that what they then deliver to the people that are learning from them. I think there's going to be some really interesting, changes that come along with that.
Could I give you a good use case?
Yeah.
I recently passed the baton of CTO to a new CTO. He just joined the organization 5-6 weeks ago. And so in preparation, I sat and I wrote a 20-page document of all of my files and where things were and what are the risks and whatever. You're going to come into an organization and there will be a virtual CTO, and that is going to be the continuity between multiple different humans, who's going to have all of my knowledge and the CTO before and the new guy. And so when someone's going to join, you're actually going to sit down and your counterpart will be there to greet you, brief you, collect your information, and make you the best CTO possible. And you won't lose the corporate knowledge because I left and he joined. Luckily we get to work together because we're still in the organization. But if I had exited with, in my old role, I took on a senior director role. I had a 90-minute overlap with my predecessor, and then she said, "Good luck," and she was off to something new. And so it was like we, starting from nothing. Right. So wouldn't it be amazing to start? And that's a phenomenal use case for knowledge, is to sort of embody it into the role. And then when I get to an organization as a project officer, as an intelligence analyst, as whatever, I have that buddy who can help me connect to all of the knowledge. Again, that's beyond chat, but so we haven't even explored. We haven't explored the beyond the tip of the iceberg of how to use the existing AI capability. It needs to come in many more form factors that we haven't even thought of, and that's what I'm really like. The sky's the limit there. Those things are going to have massive transformation, and we can't see what comes after that. I don't think anyone could see much past
No.
18 months.
No.
And that's what's been so challenging is
Yeah.
like things change day to day,
Sure.
you know, and so, yeah, again, so we kind of talked about before, like one of the things I really like about hosting the podcast here is I get to meet new people. Janik, we hadn't met each other.
No.
James, it's great to reconnect. You know, I really appreciate you guys coming in for this.
thank you.
There was some really interesting, we didn't even plan to get into talking about trust and ethics so much, but I think especially with
happy
your
we
role,
did.
that's going to be a huge area where we need to have understanding. We need to have clarity and an openness and across you know what the citizenship understands about what what the FedGov is doing. And so I think that's great. But I really appreciate you guys coming in. You know, thanks for your time. And then for those of you listening, you know, thank you for joining us for the CDW Canada Tech Talks podcast. I've been your host, KJ Burke. I'm here with Janik and James. I really appreciate you joining us for this episode of the podcast. And tune in next month where we'll have another episode of our CDW Canada Tech Talks podcast. We'll be doing another topic. And until then, keep learning, growing, and innovating.